Armored Core 4 was initially released for the PlayStation 3 in December of 2006, and then in March of the following year for the Xbox 360. The gap between these two release dates is notable because of some major differences in presentation and performance between the two systems. From Software seems to have gotten a head start on developing for the 360, releasing their first game for it, Enchanted Arms, in January of 2006. Their first PS3 release was therefore Armored Core 4. Armored Core 4 represents a lot of breaks from tradition. It was the first game in the series not published in the United States by Agetec, which marked the beginning of the end of a very long and fruitful partnership. A subsidiary of ASCII Entertainment, Agetec was kind of a middle-budget underdog publisher. They were responsible for publishing nearly every From Software game in the United States since Kingsfield, as well as bringing over lots of other cool, obscure games. Instead, publishing duties on this one were handled by Sega, who had also published the Xbox-exclusive Otogi games, as well as Chromehounds. Armored Core 4, however, would be the final game Sega imported for From Software. AC4's largest change is in its presentation, appearing closer to the bleak, frequently intensely desaturated visuals of the pre-rendered introduction animations of the last few games. Most of the footage you'll see in this video was captured via the 360 version on original hardware. I'll discuss the visual differences between it and the PS3 version a little later on. Regardless of the platform, AC4 is frequently monochromatic and always layered in a sheen of post-processing effects, and always with an aggressive layer of bloom and grain, giving the game the appearance of blown-out film. It's a highly stylized look that is harsh and occasionally even surreal. Armored Core as a series from this point forward becomes much more grim in tone, and the new visuals clearly reflect that. A lot of these aesthetic tendencies are observable not only in the game's sequel, For Answer, but also in Demon's Souls. The old film effects and the chapter introduction scenes are very similar to the ones seen in Demon's Souls. AC4, AC4 Answer, and Demon's Souls are of course the first games directed by Hidetaka Miyazaki, but I must also mention the following designers: Makoto Sato, Daisuke Satake, Hiroshi Nakamura, and Masahiro Miki. These artists have been part of the core design crew of From Software since at least Armored Core 4, and are all at least partially responsible for the high caliber visuals we've gotten in the games developed since, all the way through to Elden Ring at the time of this writing. The other large visual difference with AC4 and For Answer is the new style of the ACs themselves. The concept of humanoid mecha remains, of course, but the boxy toy robot look has been replaced with a style featuring far more curves and pointed edges. This new look has the ability to take additional advantage of the increased polygon budget found on the, at the time, next generation hardware. It's a clean, futuristic look, which again ties into the increased power, speed, and overall abilities of the ACs in this rebooted setting. Shoji Kawamori, the original designer of the ACs, is no longer present in the credits, although he did return as a guest designer in For Answer, responsible for creating the iconic white glint AC. But we'll talk about that more later when we get to For Answer. Another major change in the presentation in this one is how the story and in-game world are communicated. This is truly the beginning of Miyazaki's past tense narrative Reign of Terror. Narration between chapters is delivered via flowery monologues that occasionally felt, at least to me, like I had been dropped into the middle of a storyline without much of a proper setup. Through repeated playthroughs, I eventually found myself understanding what was going on, but I ultimately did not feel very invested in the narrative regardless. There's a feeling of disconnect between the in-game events and the events being relayed back to you in what sometimes feels like a separate narrative. The in-game world feels pretty sterile and uninhabited. No in-game cutscenes makes this feel even more disconnected, and their absence is a bit of a surprise after the increasing prevalence of them over the course of the PS2 titles. No emails or anything equivalent further adds to this feeling of isolation, which may be intentional to some degree, to be fair. Additionally, some online discourse has remarked that the English translations for and For Answer are pretty dodgy, so who knows, maybe the story is much better delivered in the original Japanese versions. Although the mission briefings are always very well animated and atmospheric, they are always being voiced by your same direct handler on behalf of the various corporations, which means that you lose the variety of characterization voices of the corporate representatives that most of the PS2 games had, which means by extension, a lack of further characterization in the world of AC4. I do have to say I really didn't enjoy most of the music in this one. It's another large mix-up for the series, with compositions that are a combination of melodramatic orchestral, as well as cheesy rock stuff that feels very much like a product of its era. Like sometimes observed in the previous games in the series, there are also a few compositions which do wear their inspirations on their sleeve. A strange design oversight is that if the music is turned off, mission briefings will be silent. But fortunately, the rest of the sound design and atmosphere is strong enough to play the game with no music and still have it be immersive regardless. As far as the sound effects go, this is a massive leap from the previous generation. Automatic machine guns, massive explosions, lasers, buildings collapsing, and the constant stomp and mechanical sounds of your AC all sound absolutely wonderful. I left the music on during my first playthrough in order to hear everything, but on my subsequent runs I turned it off, and you'd be surprised by the level of immersion this sometimes offered. It felt downright suspenseful at times when I would slowly maneuver through a stage, listening for movement and gunfire. I noticed a few moments in the PS3 version that seemed to be audio glitches, with sound effects playing back at a much louder volume than they were seemingly intended to be. This was not present in the 360 version. The only other issue I found with the sound for both versions was the very loud and annoying constant beep while low on AP. Another big mix-up are the mission stage designs. Most occur in large outdoor environments, presumably to compensate for the increased speed and scale of the ACs here. There are no maze levels to be found, with even the most complex indoor environments having about a fraction of the complexity found within the sometimes confusing complexes found in the previous games. With this change, the wireframe maps accessible on the pause screen via your AC's computer are gone, as they are basically no longer necessary. Most of the missions are extremely brief and able to be completed within a couple of minutes. This ultimately means a pretty short runtime for the campaign, as well as sometimes a feeling of just getting warmed up before you're getting sent back to the mission select screen. The game on original hardware renders at 720p and aims for 60 FPS. The 360 version mostly maintains that, and the PS3 version more frequently struggles, as I'll showcase later. The game frequently looks quite striking and dramatic. Some daylight skies are so ballooned out that the HUD is sometimes lost in them. Although the aforementioned monochromatics are present for nearly the entire game, they're used in a decent range of tones to capture the surprisingly atmospheric locales that the game throws at you. From cold metallic interiors, to sunken cities, to dim and warmly lit tunnels, to one of my favorite FromSoft motifs, the golden splendor of a marbled sunset. The ACs themselves have some really neat animations, especially the switching between hand and back weapons, as intricate little bits of machinery are activated and move around. The gameplay of AC4, as mentioned before, has a much higher emphasis on speed and mobility. Movement also feels much smoother than ever, and the feeling of feedback with the weapons and destruction they cause is very nice and very powerful. The rumble feedback in this one, when maxed out, is some of the strongest I've ever felt in a game, and adds a large feeling of tangibility to the world. Try playing this one with a wired 360 controller if possible for maximum effect. Also, it's the first AC that feels like it's taking full advantage of the level of granularity of the analog sticks, at least when it comes to aiming and manipulating your camera in the garage, allowing for some lovingly smooth camera sweeps of your AC in the void. AC4 feels a lot more like a power fantasy than the previous game starting out, where you'd start out with a really basic mech and no cash. Here, you're a powerhouse with most of the options straight out of the gate. It's definitely one of the easier games, at least on normal difficulty. Armor point numbers are generally much higher than they've been in the past, presumably to help sell the mechanical superiority of this new class of ACs, but in function you end up feeling about the same, perhaps even weaker considering how fast you can rack up damage in this one. Energy refills much quicker on average and drains slower as well. The meter no longer has a red zone, and has no penalty for completely draining it as well. Heat mechanics have finally been jettisoned, and thank goodness for that. The freedom this immediately grants to build possibilities cannot be understated. In its place is another new, significant mechanic, Primal Armor, which is like a regenerating shield that reduces the overall damage done to AP. Overboosting is still here, and consumes this new resource in addition to energy extremely quickly, making overboost a pretty bad idea in most situations. Armored Core 4 was the first game in the series to offer online multiplayer in all regions, but unfortunately this was not something I was able to experiment with. The arena exists as a simulation mode similar to Last Raven, presumably to not have to accommodate defeating ACs that have yet to turn up in the campaign. Unfortunately, there are no more post-match replays at all. The other aspect of the simulator is a test range, which is in its best form yet in the series. The campaign in AC4 is pretty short, and offers no progression routes, alternate endings, or missable missions. The game is split up into chapters with groups of different missions being offered at a time, with clear points of no return being labeled. Here's a fun fact: all of these chapter names are named after Agatha Christie novels. Completing the game on normal unlocks your standard mission selection, but more interestingly, hard mode. Any mission can be tried instantly on hard mode. You don't have to progress through the campaign again. Hard mode adds additional enemies and changes some elements with some cool surprises. It's worth doing, especially considering with how short the campaign is. Ultimately, Armored Core 4 is a breath of fresh air for a series that was in definite need of one, but it occasionally feels like a prototype, a game with a great foundation, but sometimes lacking content and polish. Still, I would recommend checking it out before playing AC4 Answer. They are directly connected in many ways and almost feel like two halves of a single game, more so than any other pair of iterations prior. Now, as promised earlier, let's take a look at the differences between the 360 and PS3 versions. There is a noticeably different color grade between the two versions, with the 360 usually looking a bit more saturated and quite a bit higher in contrast. The 360 version is also generally much darker on default settings. Boosting the in-game brightness alleviates this somewhat, but the aggressive contrast of the 360 version will ensure that the game will always look a bit more dynamic in terms of overall luminance values. Both versions are rendered at 720p, but the PS3 version lacks the anti-aliasing present in the 360 version, giving it a more jagged look. The 360 version also features more technically advanced reflection effects, although whether or not you think this looks better may come down to taste. The 360 version wins for resolution of environmental shadows, but one win for the PS3 version is an increased distance in texture filtering. The 360 version's textures start getting fuzzier a lot closer to the camera. The 360's version's actual textures may be a hair sharper in fidelity, although it could be just the higher contrast making it appear that way. A very important difference between the two versions is performance. On the 360, Armored Core 4 generally runs much better than its PS3 counterpart. Both games aim for 60 FPS, but the PS3 version dips far below that constantly. Preferring a look between the two versions is definitely subjective, but I personally prefer the 360's version's high contrast, deeper shadows, and nicer reflections. The PS3 version is slightly sterile and clinical looking in comparison. For what it's worth, as mentioned at the beginning of this video, the 360 version was released 3 months after the PS3 release, so it's possible the visual differences of the 360 version may be more in line with what they ultimately intended given the additional bit of development time. But I would say it is definitely too dark on default settings sometimes. But most of you are probably going to be playing these via emulation at this point, so let's talk about the differences there. RPCS3, the PS3 emulator. The game runs much smoother than on an actual PS3, with much faster load times. The big advantage of playing RPCS3 over anything else is that the game can be rendered above 720p, making this the highest resolution and clearest way of playing the game, although certain effects like depth of field, motion blur, and heatwave effects will sometimes look a little weird. Xenia, the Xbox 360 emulator, has pretty smooth performance. As of this writing, there is an AC texture issue when rendering the game above 1, meaning you'll still be rendering the game at 720p at the moment. It's got very fast load times, but it does have stutter compilation when in an area for the first time. Some of the 360 version exclusive effects aren't currently working at the time of this writing, like the glass reflections mentioned earlier. Xenia also features some post-processing effects that can be applied, like FXAA and AMD's FSR resampling, but I think the game looks better with both of these turned off. At the moment, I would recommend playing the 360 version on original hardware if possible, if you want what I think is still the best overall aesthetic experience. The games are all still massively inflated in price, yes, but modded 360s are pretty cheap nowadays and can be easily loaded with all sorts of games and neat homebrew. RPCS3 is a great option too, with all the super detailed AC models getting to shine when rendered at those higher resolutions. Xenia is a fine way to play without any bells or whistles, but as mentioned a minute ago, some effects are missing and you're probably going to be experiencing hitching fairly regularly during your first playthrough. Finally, in last place is the PS3 version played on original hardware. It runs pretty poorly and looks a lot rougher than the 360 version. Armored Core 4 Answer is one of the most popular entries in the series, featuring turbocharged gameplay and a lot of refinement of the elements that were introduced in AC4. In North America, it was published by Ubisoft, who had handled a few games for From Software by that point, primarily in European regions. Just like AC4 was the last game that Sega published for them, this is the last collaboration between From Software and Ubisoft. That subtitle, 4 Answer, other than being a pun, is one of those classic, vaguely existentialist phrases born from Japanese nerd culture post-Evangelion. The pre-rendered intro sequence contextualizes it. Why is all this chaos and suffering happening? Is humanity doomed? Pray for answer. As you may have inferred from the preceding sentences, this is indeed another Hidetaka Miyazaki joint. For Answer's campaign begins with an intro that more clearly sets the stage and context of its story in comparison to AC4. The destitution and emptiness of this game's environments are more contextually justified by this game's plot than the previous one. The Earth has grown so polluted that most of what's left of humanity is living in giant ships called cradles that are flying above the surface of the Earth indefinitely. As mentioned earlier, the original designer of the Armored Cores and the general mecha trailblazer, Shoji Kawamori, returned as a guest designer for this one, responsible solely for the design of White Glint. It's an iconic design and definitely synonymous with the series for those familiar with it. White Glint's giant mechanical wings also serve to reinforce that religious undertone present in AC4 and its sequel. The term Deus Ex Machina is a plot device originating from ancient Greece, wherein a catastrophe is resolved by an unlikely occurrence. In the case of the Greeks, this resolution usually was the result of an appearance of one of their gods, hence the literal translation of the term. God from the machine. It's a relevant thing to think about, considering the foreboding of extinction of humanity, and the decision of their fate by the godlike machines found within these two titles. A difference in the presentation from its predecessor are the distinct styles of mission briefings and voiceovers for the missions in this game. Each corporation again has their own handler and infographics, which help restore a bit of that character not found in AC4. Additionally, you are given the choice to accept or deny the mission after the briefing, which was strangely absent in AC4, and meant that accepting a mission meant going into it kind of blind. The missions themselves are broadly pretty similar, uncomplicated and brief, but with more variety in setting and objective. One big new addition here are the arms forts, basically gigantic boss fights with mobile weapons platforms. One of these, the Spirit of Motherwill, shares quite a bit with the Radon boss fight from Elden Ring, in which the battle begins with a long approach requiring you to dodge projectiles plummeting from above. Each of these arms forts must be destroyed in a specific manner and add some needed variety into the missions. Speaking of the missions, they are very similar to the ones found in AC4 in that none of them really require any exploration and that are mostly based around blowing things up. The outdoor environments are even bigger in this one because of the increased speed. There are only a handful that take place indoors, and those that do sometimes lack the unique atmosphere found within the ones from AC4. Some of my favorites include the early attack on the naval port of Mimir, which is basically just a shooting gallery, but the speed in which you can fly through this area, just absolutely leveling it from above, is always satisfying. The fairly restrained steel, snow, and rocky cliffs with a color palette make the massive explosions that are occurring as you rapidly sink an entire naval fleet really pop. Another highlight for me is Silent Avalanche. I'm a sucker for cool snow levels in games, and this one is a real highlight in terms of atmosphere. The Arms Fort missions are usually well designed, forcing you to handle these immense machines of firepower in unique ways, featuring some memorable mecha designs. The most visually engaging missions are probably the ones taking place on the airborne cradles, featuring the beautiful and evocative skyboxes that we've come to know and love from Software. The low point is undoubtedly defeat Orca's special AF unit, featuring several arms forts that generate massive swords made out of lasers. These then track you if you're remotely within range, and the execution of that may be the single most janky thing I've experienced in any one of From Software's games. Similar to Last Raven, For Answer features multiple routes throughout the campaign, featuring some exclusive missions and unique endings, the last of which features one of the biggest edgelord moments in all of gaming. Only one route is available to you on your first campaign, but given the brevity of the campaign, you'll most likely be inclined to replay it anyway. I think I completed my very first playthrough in about 4 hours, with the subsequent runs taking between 90 minutes and 2 hours as you continue to accumulate cash, parts, and tuning points. Hard mode again remixes the content, adding more enemies and different events in some of the missions. The arena ladder in this one is done very well. The ladder is cleanly listed underneath your current mission choices, nice and streamlined, giving you a chance to take a break from the campaign and earn some cash and parts. Like AC4, defeating opponents also earns you their schematics, allowing you to essentially play as them. The AC battles can get extremely fast, and in some cases feeling like trying to swat a fly. The menus maintain the same minimalist style of AC4 but are much clearer in organization. Buying and selling parts is presented in a much more sensible way, and the AC equipment menu is a big improvement. For Answer features even better destructible environments than the last game. The first mission immediately showcases this, as does any map featuring destructible buildings. The effect is a lot more dynamic than you might initially think. This arena map under a complex highway system is another great example. The weapon effects and explosions all look and feel fantastic too, even better than they did in AC4. The layered alpha effects combined with pieces of infrastructure exploding in fairly realistic ways adds a lot to the visceral feeling of combat here, and just the general excessive collateral damage that defines this game's universe. I think fire and smoke effects look better here than basically any of From Software's games up until maybe Sekiro. Basically anything happening with water also always looks good, but given the amount of missions occurring around water, it makes sense that they would prioritize it. One effect that From Software eased up on compared to AC4 is the post-processing effects, to some extent. The really intense heat wave effect in the deserts is gone, and the skies aren't as bloomed out as they were before. The film grain is still present and gives the lower detailed large environments some additional texture. Again, like AC4, there are basically no in-engine cutscenes, with a couple exceptions, which was a bit of a disappointment. I felt like those added a lot of character to the campaigns of the earlier games. For Answer technically features the first appearance of Patches. His name in Japanese has always been just Patch, which is what he's called here. A really unique element found within AC4 and For Answer is the ability to pick your regulation, basically choosing between the gameplay patches that were released that affects part balancing, enemy AI, and certain other gameplay variables. There are some dramatic differences in terms of speed and weapon capability. Certain builds can go from good to bad and vice versa, and correspondingly, enemy AC fights, like the one against White Glint, can become much easier. I can't think of another game that doesn't require you to be on the latest patch while playing online. This means that matchmaking will pair you up with opponents on the same regulation. However, the regulation updates are no longer officially available on PS3, meaning that alternative methods must be utilized. They're still available on the 360 versions, but you have to sign up for Xbox Live Gold in order to download them. These regulation patches are out there for Xenia and RPCS3. In For Answer, 1.2 is the fastest regulation if you want to go nuts with the speed, and 1.4 is supposedly the most balanced, but I'd recommend playing through the campaigns on 1.0 at least once, as that's what they were initially balanced around. The music in For Answer is again handled solely by Kota Hoshino, and is another mixed bag for me. It's basically in the same style of AC4, alternating between indie rock style tracks and some more quasi-avant-garde electronic as well as orchestral pieces. The title music, the garage music, and certain stage and encounter pieces are sometimes beautiful and coldly artificial in a way that gels really well with this setting. Others, however, sound closer to something from the Sonic Adventure games, with vocals, with rock guitar and acoustic drums. Although some grew on me over time, for the most part these did not work for me, either in the context of the game or otherwise. Overall, I'd say I'm definitely more into the OSTs of the earlier AC titles. In terms of reference points for this one, the central musical theme of this game is very similar to a track by the electronic musician Moby, God moving over the face of the waters. The mission briefing audio is still tied to the music slider, so if you have it turned off, it will be silent again. Because of time and tech limitations, I was again unable to try out the online multiplayer options of this game, but in a first for the series it offers online co-op, in addition to a PvP scene that is still pretty active. Check out the Armored Core Discord if you're interested. The 360 version, like AC4, again generally runs much better than the PS3 version. Likewise, the contrast is again punchier and the color is a bit more vibrant. The 360 version is not as dark by default as AC4 was. You won't find yourself in any pitch black environments on default brightness settings here. The 360 version also features higher resolution shadows and again is utilizing some form of anti-aliasing missing from the PS3 version. One advantage of the PS3 version is that the alpha effects for things like explosions look ever so slightly less pixelated, but overall, I again have to hand it to the 360 version both in terms of presentation and performance. Both can occasionally struggle in terms of FPS, especially in the Arms Force missions, but the PS3 generally has, again, worse performance, with FPS dips occurring consistently. One big disadvantage of the 360 version, at least the versions released in North America, is that the ability to import data from AC4 has been removed for some reason. One might think this might have something to do with the two games having two different publishers, but the North American PS3 version maintains this feature. Not a huge deal, but worth mentioning. Looking at the emulation options, first let's again take a look at Xenia using the latest Canary build. Xenia initially does not render AC textures correctly, but this is fixed by changing a setting in the config file. FPS is smoother than real hardware, but may be initially worse as the game goes through initial shader compilation for each area. As far as I can tell, it maintains the visuals otherwise pretty much perfectly. RPCS3 runs close to flawlessly, again supporting higher render resolutions that make the ACs look great, but again has those slight post-processing visual differences and less punchy image inherent to the PS3 version. You'll need to enable right color buffers in the graphics settings for the ACs to render correctly. Overall, I would rank the experiences in the same order as before. The 360 version with its nicer overall visuals is tied with the great performance and higher resolution rendering capabilities of RPCS3, followed by Xenia, followed by the PS3 version in last place. Given the lackluster performance of AC4 and 4Answer on the Sony system, I don't understand why the physical copies of those versions go for so much more than the 360 versions. As mentioned earlier, AC4 and 4Answer are really two peas in a pod and should be played together, in my opinion. If you, for some reason, were insistent on only playing one of them, I would recommend AC4 if you're looking for more atmospheric missions, and 4Answer if you're looking for faster speeds and those big Arms Force boss fights. I like both of them and will definitely be replaying them in the future. Mechanically, they are both a lot of fun with great core mechanics and controls. I think the biggest flaw with both is that I never felt super hooked in the campaign like I was in AC1, AC2, or 3. Those games had pretty engaging plot structures, immersive worlds, and the end games all felt really climactic, especially AC2. But again, both AC4 and 4Answer are both cool games, and I would definitely recommend them. Next time, we enter the final frontier with two games that I have not played at all yet. Armored Core 5 and Armored Core Verdict Day. These will be completely fresh for me, so I'm looking forward to it. I'll again be comparing the tech and presentation stuff too. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.